1. The ship nobody should have let dock. Picture this. You're standing on a harbor in 1347, Mediterranean breeze on your face, fishermen pulling nets, merchants arguing over prices, children chasing seagulls along the pier. Just another Tuesday in Messina, Sicily. Then you notice it. A fleet of Genoese trading ships drifting toward port from the Black Sea. Something is off. The sails hang loose. Nobody is waving from the deck. Nobody is steering. When the harbor workers finally board, they find something that will haunt Europe for the next 7 years. Most of the crew is dead. The ones still alive are covered in black swollen lumps, oozing blood and pus. They're burning with fever. They can barely speak. The harbor master orders the ships out immediately. Get them away from the city. But it's already too late, because the disease didn't just travel on people. It traveled on rats, and the rats had already left the ship. Within days, people in Messina start getting sick. Within weeks, entire families are dead. Within months, the disease has spread to mainland Italy, and then France, and then Spain, and then England. Within 4 years, a third of Europe is gone. Some historians say half, between 75 and 200 million people, dead. And it all started because one harbor didn't turn away 12 ships fast enough. But the ships were only the beginning. What came after was so much worse, because the plague didn't just kill people. It dismantled civilization piece by piece, and it did it in ways that nobody saw coming. 2. The flea you never felt bite you. Here's how you actually caught the plague. You didn't need to touch a sick person. You didn't need to breathe the same air, though that helped. All you needed was one flea. One single flea riding on one single rat that crawled through one single crack in your wall while you were sleeping. The bacterium was called Yersinia pestis. It lived in the gut of a flea. When the flea bit a rat and the rat died, the flea jumped to the next warm body it could find. That was you. One bite. That's all it took. You wouldn't even feel it. By the time you noticed the swelling in your neck, or your armpit, or your groin, the bacteria had already invaded your lymph nodes. Those swellings were called buboes. They turned black. They grew to the size of eggs. Some of them burst open on their own. But the bubonic form wasn't even the worst version. There was the pneumonic plague, where the bacteria reached your lungs. Now you could spread it just by breathing near someone, coughing, talking, singing in church on Sunday morning. And then there was the septicemic form, where the infection went straight into your bloodstream. Your skin turned dark purple. Your organs failed. You could be perfectly fine at breakfast and dead before dinner. No swelling, no warning, just gone. The people of the 14th century had no idea what bacteria were. They couldn't see the fleas under a microscope. They didn't know rats were involved. They just knew that people were dying faster than anyone could count, and the ways they tried to stop it only made everything worse. 3. The cures that killed faster than the disease. When the plague hit a city, the first thing people did was call for a doctor, and the doctor showed up. God help everyone, the doctors showed up. Medieval plague doctors are famous now for those long-beaked masks stuffed with flowers and herbs. They believed disease traveled through bad smells, a theory called miasma. So they figured if you couldn't smell the death couldn't reach you. It didn't work, not even a little. But that was just the start. Doctors would lance the buboes, cutting them open and draining the pus. Sometimes they cauterized the wounds with red-hot pokers. They prescribed bloodletting because of course they did. They told patients to sit between 2 large fires to sweat the sickness out. They bathed wounds in vinegar and rosewater. One popular treatment involved strapping a live chicken directly to the infected bubo. The idea was that the chicken would absorb the poison. It didn't. Some physicians recommended drinking liquid gold. Others told patients to sit inside a sewer because the stronger stench would supposedly overpower the plague vapors. One French doctor prescribed grinding emeralds into a fine powder and swallowing them. If you were wealthy enough to afford emeralds during a pandemic, congratulations, you just poisoned yourself with gemstones. The thing is, none of these treatments worked because none of them addressed the actual problem. The fleas were still biting. The rats were still breeding. And every time a doctor moved from one patient to the next, he carried the bacteria with him on his robes, on his hands, on his instruments. The healers became the spreaders. The people you ran to for salvation were the ones accelerating your death. 4. The quarantine that came too late. Some cities figured out one thing early. Isolation worked. If you kept the sick away from the healthy, fewer people died. The problem was execution. Venice was one of the first to try. Ships arriving at port were forced to anchor offshore for 40 days before anyone could set foot on land. The Italian word for 40 is quaranta, and that's where the word quarantine comes from. 40 days floating on a ship surrounded by dying sailors and multiplying rats. If you weren't infected when the quarantine started, you almost certainly were by day 5. Milan took a more brutal approach. When the plague appeared in a household, the city didn't just quarantine the sick. They sealed the entire house, doors nailed shut, windows boarded up. Everyone inside, sick or healthy, was locked in together. Left to either recover or die behind walls, no one would open. Milan ended up with one of the lowest death rates in Europe. The method worked, but the cost was horrifying. Entire families were entombed alive inside their own homes. Other cities tried building pest houses, separate buildings where the sick were hauled off to, but these quickly became warehouses of death. Overcrowded, understaffed, no medicine, no clean water. People were dumped inside and forgotten. The caretakers either fled or died themselves, and the bodies piled up faster than anyone could remove them. Quarantine slowed the plague in some places, but in most cities it arrived too late. By the time officials decided to act, the rats had already spread through every alley, every basement, every grain store in town. You can't quarantine a city that's already rotting from the inside out. 5. The graves that couldn't hold the dead. In the early weeks of the plague, cities buried their dead properly. Individual graves, wooden coffins, priests reading last rites over each body. That didn't last. As the death toll climbed, coffins ran out. Wood ran out. Gravediggers ran out because gravediggers kept dying. Churches ran out of cemetery space. Bodies began piling up outside homes in alleys in the middle of the street. The smell became unbearable. Entire neighborhoods reeked of decomposition so thick you could taste it. Cities resorted to mass graves. Trenches were dug outside the walls and bodies were thrown in by the hundreds. In some places, they stacked corpses in layers with thin coatings of dirt between them, like some grotesque lasagna of human remains. Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, wrote that the dead were treated with no more ceremony than goats. Carts rolled through the streets at night, collecting bodies. If you died alone and nobody found you for a few days, the rats got to you first. In Avignon, France, the Pope consecrated the entire Rhone River so that bodies could be dumped into it as a form of sanctified burial. The river became a channel of floating corpses. Downstream villages started getting sick shortly after. Nobody connected the dots. And then there was the psychological damage. Imagine watching your mother, your father, your children carried off on a cart, like refuse. No funeral, no prayers, no farewell, just a pit in the ground and a shovel of dirt. The plague didn't just destroy people's bodies, it destroyed their dignity, it destroyed their rituals. It stripped away the last thread of normalcy that kept a society from completely unraveling. 6. The economy that ate itself. When a third of your workforce drops dead in under 2 years, economies don't slow down, they collapse. Farms were abandoned because there was nobody left to work them. Crops rotted in the fields. Livestock wandered free because their owners were in the ground. The price of food skyrocketed. A loaf of bread that cost a penny before the plague now cost 10 times as much if you could even find one to buy. Trades and crafts disappeared overnight. Blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters, masons, dead. The knowledge died with them. An entire generation of skilled labor wiped from existence. Buildings went unrepaired. Roads crumbled. Infrastructure decayed because the hands that maintained it were gone. But here's the twist nobody expected. The survivors suddenly had leverage. With so few workers remaining, laborers could demand higher wages. Peasants who had been tied to a lord's land for generations simply walked away. Why stay on one farm when 3 other landowners were desperately offering better conditions? The feudal system that had controlled European society for centuries began cracking at its foundation. Lords tried to pass laws forcing wages back down. It didn't work. Workers had tasted power, and they weren't giving it back. The plague didn't just wreck economies, it restructured them entirely. The old world where you were born into your station and died in it was breaking apart. And the new one was being built on a foundation of 100 million corpses. 7. The scapegoats who burned. When people are dying and nobody knows why, they don't just sit with the uncertainty. They find someone to blame. In the 14th century, that someone was the Jewish community. Rumors spread like fire that Jews were poisoning wells to cause the plague. There was zero evidence, absolutely none. But evidence didn't matter. Fear needed a target, and the Jewish population was the easiest one available. They were a minority. They were already mistrusted. And in some areas they seemed to die at slightly lower rates, likely because of hygiene practices within their communities, which only poured fuel on the conspiracy. In Strasbourg in February 1349, before the plague had even reached the city, 2,000 Jewish residents were rounded up and burned alive on a wooden platform in the town square. Their property was seized. Their debts to Christian borrowers were conveniently erased. In Basel, they were locked inside a wooden building on an island in the Rhine and set on fire. In Mainz, the Jewish community, realizing what was about to happen, set fire to their own homes and chose to die on their own terms rather than face the mob. Across Europe, over 200 Jewish communities were wiped out during the plague years. Entire populations slaughtered. Pope Clement VI actually issued papal orders declaring that Jews were not responsible for the plague and that anyone who harmed them was acting against the Church. Almost nobody listened. The plague revealed something no amount of civilization could disguise. When humans get scared enough, they don't just look for explanations. They look for victims. And once the violence starts, it doesn't need logic to sustain itself. It feeds on its own momentum. 8. The flagellants who made it worse. In the absence of real answers, religion filled the void, but not the quiet, comforting kind, the extreme bleeding, terrifying kind. Groups of people called flagellants marched from city to city in processions of hundreds, sometimes thousands. They stripped to the waist. They whipped themselves with leather straps embedded with iron spikes. Blood poured down their backs as they paraded through town squares, chanting prayers and begging God for mercy. The idea was that the plague was divine punishment, and only through extreme public suffering could humanity earn forgiveness. Crowds gathered to watch. Some joined the procession. Others collected the flagellant's blood on rags, believing it had sacred healing power. City officials welcomed them at first, hoping their visible anguish might actually appease whatever force had unleashed this nightmare. It didn't. What the flagellants did bring was more disease. Hundreds of unwashed, bleeding travelers, moving from town to town, gathering in tight crowds, sharing food and sleeping quarters. They were a walking transmission network. Every city they visited saw a spike in infections shortly after their arrival. They also brought violence. The flagellant movement became deeply entangled with anti-Semitism. Many of the worst massacres of Jewish communities were led or encouraged by flagellant groups passing through. Eventually, Pope Clement VI banned the movement entirely. But by then, the damage had already spread far beyond any decree's reach. The flagellants had turned suffering into performance, and performance into more death. 9. The psychological fracture. The plague didn't just attack bodies, it attacked minds, and the psychological wreckage lasted far longer than the disease itself. People stopped planning for the future because there was no future worth planning for. Why build a house if you'll be dead in a month? Why plant crops you'll never live to harvest? Some threw themselves into total excess. They drank, they feasted. They spent every last coin because saving anything seemed absurd. Boccaccio described people in Florence who abandoned all restraint living each day as though it were their final one because it genuinely might have been. Others went the opposite direction. They sealed themselves away, spoke to no one, trusted nothing. Every cough from a stranger was a death sentence. Every knock on the door was a threat. Families abandoned their own sick. Parents left children. Children left parents. Husbands fled from dying wives. The bonds that held communities together dissolved completely under the crushing weight of raw survival instinct. Clergy abandoned their parishes. Doctors refused patients. Lawyers wouldn't draft wills because they refused to step inside a dying person's house. The social contract that holds civilization together just evaporated. People weren't living anymore. They were simply waiting, counting the hours until it was their turn. And for many, the guilt of surviving was almost worse than the sickness itself. Why did you make it when your entire family didn't? Why were you spared when your neighbors weren't? There was no answer. There was never going to be one. Just empty streets and silence where voices used to be.